Welcome to the third installment of Sacred Codes at the Vienna Academy of Visionary Art. And we're going to look at two presentations this morning. The first one being on static and dynamic composition, and the second one being on spectral color. So, static and dynamic composition, I would like to begin with this sarcophagus from ancient Greece. And it exists here in Vienna at the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. And just allow your eye to wander over the image for a while and ask yourself, did the artist compose his figures randomly or with a certain order in mind? It's called the battle with the Amazonians. You have female figures battling male figures, the females being the Amazonians. And in the center you have this fallen comrade here. Remember, it's on a sarcophagus, and so the theme is death. And now, is there some order that you can detect, kind of a hidden order, hidden lines within this image? We've used this image in class. We went to the Kunsthistorisches Museum. We did our own drawings and sketches to try and find out what the underlying order is. And one suggestion then was these diagonals. And definitely within ancient Greece, there's this noted preference for what's called the heroic diagonal, when a figure like this, and this is a bracketing figure, he's turning in towards the composition, assumes this diagonal stance. He assumes the heroic diagonal, as it's called. Obviously the horses leading in towards the center, with this central figure being very important. And it's basically a symmetrical composition, and yet it has a certain dynamism, and a dynamism thanks to the diagonals. So when we talk about all of these lines underlying a composition, in English we describe this as the armature. But in French, charpente, which is to say any structure underlying or supporting a building, like Italian, Trame, and German, Bildkonstruktion. So whatever language we're talking about, what we're seeing are lines, and what we're actually seeing are invisible lines, because once the artist has finished their work, those lines become invisible. And Sacred Codes is really about the invisible lines underlying a lot of the constructions in a work of art. And that can be the lines for proportion. It can be the lines that are more dynamic, showing us the energy of a figure in the pose. And it can be the armature for the composition. And that's what we're going to look at today. So one thing I've come to notice teaching this is that often students will begin a painting with lots and lots of lines, because I'm going to show you lots of lines during this presentation. And it gets to the point that there's so many lines underlying their drawing that they start to become a little bit inhibited. And it made me think of this poem by Rilke, where he was sitting in the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, and he was watching this poor panther caught in a small cage in the zoo, walking around in tight circles. And Rilke wrote about the panther, "His gaze against the sweeping of the bars has grown so weary it can hold no more. To him there seems to be 1,000 bars, and back behind those 1,000 bars, no world." If that's what armature becomes for you when you're painting, then throw it away. Yeah, you don't need armature. You don't need all those thousands of lines to block your vision. That's not the idea. The idea is to have a creative engagement with those lines, to circle around them, to weave in and out, to be playful. And that brings me to Blake's poem about the tiger. So instead of this poor panther caught in its cage, you have Blake's tiger burning bright in the forests of the night. What immortal hand or eye could dare frame thy fearful symmetry? That's how you should be thinking of armature, I believe, as something playful, as something to engage your imagination. And definitely when you turn to the Gothic cathedrals, they had extremely playful imaginations, and yet their imagination was working within certain defining lines. This is called the quatrefoil, and there were two types of quatrefoil, the cruciform quatrefoil and the barbed quatrefoil. And you can see that to make it, the mason took a block, and on his block he used his compass and his straight rule, and he made his initial design. And we're going to focus on this design, the barbed quatrefoil, which is basically you have a square, you put an X in the square, and then you put a rhombus or diamond as well, which is the turned square. And then that gives you those points in which to draw your circles. And as you'll see, this little tip here and here and here do become important in the design of what's called the barbed quatrefoil. So this creative artist has drawn that design on his block simply to get that outline that we're talking about. And now that he has that shape to work from, let's see if his imagination takes advantage of that shape. This is a rather fascinating example of the Gothic imagination, where you have twins opposite each other, but in two directions. In other words, you can see there's one vertical upright, one vertical down, or one horizontal this way and one horizontal that way. He's obviously seen the four parts of his composition and decided to play with each of those four parts and create this interesting play of the imagination. That, to me, is a good example of how you can use armature as an inspiration for what you're doing. Moving on now, looking at that initial shape, we'll notice that you have strong orthogonals, which is to say verticals and horizontals, and you have strong diagonals as well as circles. And in each of these three examples, you can see that the artist has chosen to follow one or the other, which is to say, when he decides to follow the orthogonals, he ends up with a very static composition. You have, this is not Christ, but actually God, sitting with the world in his hand, and he is creating the world. And so God, the creator, very static image, symmetrical, centralized, and so on. Here, a much more playful image of this creature, an imaginative creature. Perhaps it's a nun or a sister, but a serpentine, lizard-like nun or sister. And he's obviously now forgotten about the horizontals and preferred to move with the circular lines. And so especially in the tail over here, we can see that he's very aware of the circle over here, and he's working within the circles to create his design. Last one, obviously, is very diagonal, that he's used his diagonals in order to create this contrapposto figure. We learned the expression contrapposto last week. Turning one way and the other way, it's an extreme contrapposto, and that is dynamism is created by following the diagonals as opposed to the verticals or orthogonals. That brings me to the principles of Gothic design, and we've seen this expression before, ad quadratum, ad triangulum. These are from the notebooks of Villard d'Ancourt, and he has drawn the foundation for a church here, a Cistercian abbey actually, and he has done it in the ad quadratum fashion, which is to say ad quadratum from the square. You use the square as your starting point for the design. And if you do use the square as a starting point for your design, you're going to be working with 90-degree angles, 90-degree orthogonals. The other design principle in Gothic cathedrals was ad triangulum, from the triangle, or beginning with the triangle. And now your angles are going to be 60 degrees. Whether you have the horizontal or those two diagonals, you're always working with 60-degree angles. And you can see, for example, in this tracery from this ogival arch from the Gothic period, he's created his trefoils, not quatrefoils, but trefoils inside here. And each trefoil is 3 circles in a triangle. And then these themselves are 3 smaller triangles in 1 larger triangle. Typically, the elevation of a Gothic cathedral was done ad triangulum, but not exclusively. It could have been with the turned octagram or something else as well. And typically, the ground plan was ad quadratum. Now, that seems pretty simple and straightforward, and we should think about applying those principles to the designs of our paintings. But we have to become aware of something, and it took me quite a while to actually make this realization. And that realization is ad triangulum and ad quadratum are 2 very exclusive principles. You can't combine them. Which is to say, once you've got a 60-degree diagonal grid and you try to impose a 90-degree orthogonal grid on top of that, you'll never do it consistently. They'll never match up, right? So the ad triangulum grid will always remain independent of the ad quadratum. If you want to put diagonals in your square, then you have to put a 45-degree angle, not a 60-degree angle. And once you put in your 45-degree angle, then it'll match up and you can have diagonals as well as orthogonals in your design. And that's what happened, for example, with this design over here, that he used 45-degree angles, not 60-degree angles. So think about that when you're creating a design, that if your diagonals are 45-degree, then you can complement it with your squares. But otherwise, pure ad triangulum is 60 degrees. So now I'm taking an example from a book by Charles Boulot called The Painter's Secret Geometry, a study of composition in art. It was out of print for the longest time, but it's recently come back into print. And he gives numerous examples of how certain geometries underlie the compositions. So we're still in the medieval or Gothic period, but now around the 14 or 1500s. And here with these 2 designs, which I would say are quite hieratic still, that we're still within the domain of a fairly sacred art. He's used either the octagram or the turned octagram. Octagram being an 8-pointed shape. And with those 8 points, you can either have the flat on top, or you can have the sharp point on top. When the sharp point is on top, you have what's called the turned octagram. And you can see what the difference is. With the regular octagram, you have stronger horizontals and verticals, although there are still diagonals to play with. Whereas here, it's the diagonals that come to the fore. And that becomes obvious in this design, where here you have, again, a very static, symmetrical design based on the verticals. And so it has a very sacred kind of element to it. This is John the Baptist baptizing Christ with an angel to the right. The angel to the right balancing John the Baptist on the left. And here you have Christ confronting Satan in the desert. And now the artist has decided to focus more on the diagonals, and especially with the legs of Satan, but also with the arms of Christ, that he's using all his diagonals in order to give a much more dynamic movement to his composition. So these fundamental principles are there from the very beginning, and they just move through the history of art century by century. Moving from the square and the circle, which are important hieratic design principles, to the rectangle. And the rectangle can remain important in sacred art, but now we're talking about the human form in the rectangle and how the human form will fit gracefully and proportionally into the rectangle. Here from the Très riche Heure de Duc de Berry, you have an image of paradise, the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve. And you can see Eve is taking the apple, she's offering it to Adam, and then God becomes aware of what's happened, and they are banished from the garden. The garden is portrayed as a circle, circle being the shape of perfection, Within that circle, the artist has inscribed pentagons, 2 of them. A regular pentagon, which you see here, bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then the turned pentagon, which the top is now inverted so that the top is at the bottom here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So he's taken the line over here and used where they've crossed and used that to determine then the shape of this sacred fountain where the 4 rivers of Eden flow out. And now he introduces another interesting principle. The circle is squared, and from the squared circle we draw a diagonal through the square, and then we use that diagonal to extend a line beyond the square, both this way and that way. That will become an important principle, what's called a root rectangle, and we'll look at that later on. In this case, by extending the diagonal down below, he's able to extend space. We're moving outside of the squared circle. The gate is the gate of heaven, the gate of paradise is the square in the circle. And when you move beyond it, you create the rectangle, which is to say the space outside of paradise. And similarly then, that is used to determine the heights of these various architectural elements as well. So, fascinating use of geometry, the pentagon in the circle and the turned pentagon, and how those extend outward into rectangular shapes. So, moving beyond the Gothic and medieval period into, well, in this case, Gustave Moreau, and the rectangle. I love the Gustave Moreau Museum in Paris. I go there as often as I can. And one day I photographed this unfinished sketch by Moreau, and it just caught my eye in terms of composition, that he was doing something in this rough sketch, which I believe was purely intuitive, and yet even though it was intuitive, he was following certain principles which were so deeply ingrained in his training that the shapes just naturally follow some of those important diagonals that go into the creation of what I will call the harmonic armature. And this is the harmonic armature. I'm sure you've seen it before in books on composition. And we're going to go a bit deeper into it and to explain why it's called the harmonic armature. What is it that makes it such an important device to use when you're composing a painting, just as Gustave Moreau did over here, and as I said, in a playful, intuitive way, not following lines. When you look closely at this original, which I did, you don't see the lines. I don't think he even drew the lines. He just felt them. And after a while, you should, like a good musician, be able to feel harmony and know it intuitively rather than have to construct it. So, harmony of space in a rectangle, and this is with any rectangle. You can draw this into any rectangle and it will give you the harmonious points. So the important points are draw an X, and by drawing an X, that gives you a point at the very center of that space, which we'll call the halves. And obviously any sacred work of art is going to focus on that center point. In the creation of Buddhist tankas, I've read manuals where they say the first thing you do is draw an X. I've read Byzantine manuals of painting and they say to their students, first draw an X in your composition. Establish that central point. Well, that's called the halves because it reaches exactly the halfway point, both vertically and horizontally in space, as well as diagonally. The thirds are a bit more difficult to construct, but just think in your mind, draw the 4 V's. You're going to draw 4 V's. Here's one V sideways, right? From corner to corner, going to the halfway point. 1. And then do the opposite, from corner to the halfway point. 2. Do another one inverted. 3. And do the other one upright. 4. That gives you the 4 V's, or 4 A's, however you want to imagine it. And from the point at which they cross, and it's a bit delicate, is it here, is it here? No, it's the one in between them. This will then give you the thirds. And obviously, space is divided into 3s in all directions. So those points are called the thirds, and they are harmonious points in your painting. Last one then is the quarters. And we've already drawn our X from here. Now we're going to put in a rhombus or diamond here, and where they cross, that gives us the quarters. And you would imagine that there is another line in the center here, but the important points are 1, 2, 3, 4 as your quarters. Now, why are those points harmonious? We turn to Pythagoras. We turn to the monochord, and Pythagoras was the first philosopher and musician to recognize those specific harmonies. There's much more. The laws of harmony developed continuously over time until by the 1700s we could actually attune many instruments together to form an orchestra. That didn't happen until 1700 years after, or more, 2,000 years after Pythagoras, 2,300 or so. Pythagoras was walking along one day, and some men were hammering, and he noticed that the hammers were making different sounds and tones, and he could hear a certain harmony within the hammerings. And so he started to investigate with glasses of water partly filled, with flutes, and especially with strings and string lengths, until he came up with the idea of an instrument which has 4 strings, a tetrachord, and playing the 4 strings. Now, around the 1500s, the Renaissance, people became fascinated by this thing called the monochord. And the monochord is simply a guitar with 1 string, and you would then hold the string down at the center and pluck it, and then pluck it again with the open string, and see if you could find a harmony between the divided string and the whole string. And it was a whole process of experimentation to find different harmonic notes through the monochord. Alex Gray has created this beautiful painting for, I believe it's a school of music in England, and it's called the monochord. You see here this figure moving in a graceful contrapposto twist around this one line, which we called it the Brahma Sutra or plumb line when we were talking about the pose, but in this case it's actually the monochord, and he's moving harmonically through space and sound and in this image. So let's look closely at harmony. And the famous School of Athens by Raphael, with Plato and Aristotle in the center, and down on the left over here we have the figure of Pythagoras. And Pythagoras is writing something into a book, and a little assistant is holding this tablet. And this tablet has become kind of famous in history. A close-up, you can see the tablet down here. And what the design on the tablet shows us is basically this. I've translated the letters into English because they're in Latin, but basically what you're seeing on the tablet is that. The design down here is called in Pythagorean language the tetractys, which is to say you have 10 usually points. Here they're more like lines. 1 at the top, followed by 2, followed by 3, followed by 4. And altogether they make 10. And what you see down here is an X, which is to say the numeral for 10. The idea is all began with the one, the divine one in creation. The divine one became 2. The divine 2, the pair, the dyad, became 3, the triad. And finally, the triad became 4. So there's a relationship of 1 to 2, there's a relationship of 2 to 3, and there's a relationship of 3 to 4. Can we find that same relationship in sound and in space? So definitely within sound, we can. And this is what he's trying to represent here. The 1 to 2 diapason, the 2 to 3 diapente, and the 3 to 4 diatessaron. And we'll look at that in detail in a moment. And at the top, we're talking about the design here on the tablet. At the top, you have 6, 8, 9, 12. So let's try to figure this out. Basically, what you're seeing is a representation of a tetrachord, or a kind of a lyre. You know, the instrument that they used in ancient Greece, like a harp, that had sometimes 7, sometimes 4 strings. Now, just to go back for a moment, when you actually play that instrument, as you'll see, the strings are all the same length. And they're the same length because you tighten the string in order to make the string sound at a higher note. And it's easier to play if they're all the same length. But if I allowed, like as with a monochord, if I allowed the monochord to have a full 12 units as its open string, and then I hold it at certain points. If I hold it at the 9 point, if I hold it at the 8 point, if I hold it at the 6 point, and I compare, you know, I strike this open string, and then I hold it at the 6, and I strike it again, I will get 2 tones. And that is the beginning of harmony. That when you do hold the string at the halfway point, which is called the diapason, then you hear a harmonious relationship between the 2 notes. And let's just listen to what I'm talking about, because it makes more sense if you can hear it as well as see it. So this is now the diapason, the relationship, the ratio of 1 to 2. And here it's 6 to 12 because we want to compare them to each other, so we're using 12 units. So the ratio of 1 to 2, here 6 to 12, divides the whole at the halfway point, creating 2 notes that resound harmoniously at the half string in the whole, which is to say the octave in music. The original oneness, the whole string in 12 parts, divides in 2. So that gives us a sound like this. So you heard the first 2 notes together, making the harmony, and then the 2 notes separately afterwards. The diapente now is the ratio of 2 to 3. Remember, we're going from 1 to 2 to 2 to 3 to 3 to 4. And so now we're at the 2 to 3, which expressed in terms of 12 would be 8 to 12. And that divides the whole at the 2/3 point, creating 2 notes that resound harmoniously. So the 12 and the 8, right? This happens on the tetrachord twice, because you can also find that same relationship with the 6 and 9 string. That in fact 6 is 2/3 of 9. So we have it in both cases. So with the 9 to 12 and with the 6 to 9, you get, with the 8 to 12 and with the 6 to 9, you get the 2/3 resounding twice on your tetrachord. If I play the 2/3 for you, it sounds, first we'll hear them together and then separately. Okay, and the last one then is the diatessaron, the ratio of 3 to 4. Here it appears as 9 to 12. And once again, it is the 3/4 point of the whole, and that 3/4 point can occur twice at the 9 to 12, but as well with the 6 and 8 string, that the 6 now being 3/4 of the 8 string. So you'll have that relationship happening both here and here. Let's listen to that last one. So what you've heard, so to speak, is how the 1 divides into the 2 in this tetractys from Pythagoras, how the 2 divides into 3 harmoniously, and how the 3 divides with the 4 harmoniously. So that's the case with sound, but what about space? And sure enough, this all does apply to space as well. Because the reason why I drew out these strings as specific lengths with the 6, 8, 9, 12 that we saw on the top of Raphael's tablet is because if you imagine now Moreau's painting here, and 0 is at the top and the bottom, and you measure out 12 this way and that way, and likewise 12 this way and that way, then you can see that the 6, which is the half, is 6 in every direction, right? So this point in space is the diapason. It's the halfway point. It's the harmony between the part, the 6, and the whole, right? That this relationship holds the harmonious relationship between this point and the entire length, as well as the entire height, as well as the entire diagonal space in the painting. That's the case with the diapason, the half. In terms of the diapente, the thirds, right? That now you're going to go into the 2/3 point. The 2/3 point being either, where are we? 9 to 12, right? And 9 to 12 being these points. No, I think I have that wrong. That's the quarters. The thirds would be here, yeah. So here you have the thirds, okay? 8 to 12, I should be saying. And you have the third here, 8 to 12. You have the third here, 8 to 12, 8 to 12, 8 to 12. In this case, Moreau did not use the thirds. He used the quarters, the 9 to 12. And he's clearly placed her on the 3/4 and placed some interesting things happening for the eye in those positions. That's what makes his composition harmonious. That he has placed this harmonious figure, probably Venus because she's on a shell, in a position of using the note, the thirds, and if I was to play you that note again, you're getting that relationship in space, what you are now hearing in sound. So that's why we're using this harmonic armature. That's the theory behind it. We have very few examples where the artists have left behind the actual lines used in a painting. This is one of the rare examples from Claude Lorrain, and he drew what we can recognize as part of the standard armature. He was focusing more on the half and the quarters in this one. And did he use it? Yes, that definitely he wants the eye to be attracted to this area of the composition, this area of the composition. The rest is kind of open space and so on. But he is trying to create a fairly harmonious view onto the harbor for which he was famous in his paintings. And it's actually the light which is the most important element of Claude Lorrain. Another example, again, the same armature structure, looking at the halves and the quarters. And sure enough, this tower comes right up, not exactly on the center because, you know, we have to be a little bit interesting, but close to the center. You know, you don't follow these lines religiously. You use them as rough guidelines for where you're going to place your elements. If we go back to Gustave Moreau, and as I said, these harmonic armatures can fit on any shaped rectangle. So here, this is not any kind of specific rectangle, but an irregular rectangle. Nevertheless, there's a strong diagonal in any rectangle, and he's using that strong diagonal. But he's also got other diagonals that he can play with in the composition. And again, I believe that Moreau does all of this quite intuitively. I don't think he's really sitting there and drawing his harmonic armatures. But it is surprising how often certain lines do follow those basic diagonals that give him his harmonic points, and then he's allowed to put interesting things happening. For example, her hand touches his hand exactly at the very center of the composition. Whether that was determined or chance is hard to say, but it definitely seems to be non-coincidental. The last example, again, The Birth of Venus by Gustave Moreau. And again, he prefers to have certain horizontal figures, but also strong diagonals and an interesting interaction between the diagonals and the verticals and horizontals. Okay, before leaving harmonic space, I just want to come to Leon Battista Alberti's harmonic proportions. And this is coming from his book on the art of building, his book on architecture. And he's actually talking about the shape of rooms and the harmonic shape of rooms. This is during the Renaissance now. And nevertheless, what he writes about the shape of rooms also applies to the shape of canvases. And he's trying to apply they recently rediscovered, although Pythagoras, thanks to Boethius and other writers, his theories did move all the way through time, through the Middle Ages, into the Renaissance, but definitely it had a resurgence during the Renaissance. The Pythagorean ideas of the diapason, diapente, and diatessaron. He's going to give us a short type of room, he's going to give us a moderate type of room, and he's going to give us a long type of room. And he's going to give us 3 examples. Now, the first one is simply a square, 1 to 1. That's fairly harmonious, no problem there. 2 to 3, that is the diapente. So he takes 2 units, 1, 2, another 2 units here, 1, 2, adds a third horizontally to give us the 2 to 3. And that would create a harmonious space. Similarly, diatessaron, if you took 3 to 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then added a 4th one horizontally, there gives you a nice canvas or room to work in. If you want to extend that, he doubles it in one direction only, but sometimes in both directions. What he calls the moderate type, now you're going to extend the square horizontally in one direction only, so you get a 1 to 2. And 1 to 2 is one of those rectangles that's used throughout history. The Egyptians often created their sarcophagus in the tombs in a 1 to 2 rectangle, for example. With what he calls then the double diapente, he's now doing it in 2 directions. He's taking a square and he's multiplying it not just horizontally but also vertically until he ends up with a 4 to 9. So he's taking, in other words, the 2 to 3 ratio, and then 2 to 3 become, you double the 2 or multiply it twice, that becomes 4, multiply the 3 and you get the 9. So now you have a 4 this way and 9 that way rectangle. And he'll do the same thing with the 3/4. He'll multiply it twice, and that'll give him 9 on one side and 16 on the other. So obviously these are not the same size, but we're talking about proportions here. Last one, the long type then. He simply doubles the diapente in one direction. And when you, sorry, not this one, I mean this one. He takes the diapente and he doubles this one. And when you do double it, you actually end up with 3 squares. So it could be called the triple square or the double diapente. Double diatessaron, now we're taking this one and we're doubling it in one direction to get 3 by 8. And last one, simply the square multiplied 4 times in one direction. Now, when we actually turn to the Renaissance and look at some of the canvas shapes that artists were using, they do in fact follow those basic shapes. And that was also the case with the academic art of historical painting and the neoclassical period. And we'll take as an example this painting by Girodet. It's your typical historical painting based on a moment in Roman and Greek history. In this case, Hippocrates, who we know is the great doctor of ancient Greece, is refusing the gifts of Artaxerxes. And how does he compose his composition? What principles does he use to create this composition? Where's Hippocrates? Where's Artaxerxes? Who are the important figures? Where's the important actions, right? Start looking at it and ask yourself, what shapes is he using? What grids, what rectangles to make it? Now we're fortunate that in this case we do have the underdrawing to this painting with the lines intact. And in this case, Girodet is clearly using a 3x4 rectangle. He's thinking in terms of classical harmony. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then he draws his diagonals. Remember, we talked about this, not 60-degree, but 45-degree diagonals, because only 45-degree diagonals fit within squares. So he's drawn his 45-degree diagonals, and that's allowed him to determine certain important points in his composition. One, obviously, being here, that the main figure, Hippocrates, is at the 3/4 point in the composition. And if you go to the halves, which is to say here, and you look at the half, well, the main point of action in that painting, where his hand is refusing the gifts, well, that happens right exactly at the center. In the final version, he does extend the space up a little bit over here, but otherwise this all remains fairly cohesive, that he remains at the 3/4 in terms of the horizontal space of the painting. And this is what they want. They want, remember the Greek sarcophagus that we saw at the very beginning of this lecture? A frieze of figures where there's a certain harmony, diagonals, and so on within that frieze of figures. He's thinking very much in terms of that sarcophagus that we saw at the beginning and how you can harmoniously arrange figures into a composition. So this is a good example then of fitting a composition within a 3x4 diatessaron rectangle. Let's jump back in time to the Byzantine period. And the reason why I'm doing this is to establish a very simple principle which will then show itself again and again throughout art history. It's called the rabattement in French, which we use in English, or we can call it the infolding of the line. You have a rectangle, and you want to make a square within that rectangle. How do you make a square? Well, you take the short end of the rectangle, and you simply infold, or rabat in French, you infold until you get this point, and you draw your line. That's what's happened over here. They draw this arc, and that gives point C. And you can do it the opposite direction to get point D, and now you have a square. A, B, C, D, this is your square. In this case, he definitely used that as part of his construction because he then found the center point of that line, and with that center point, he drew the halo around the prophet Elijah. Now that you've got the halo, which is an extremely important measure in Byzantine painting, you can draw some lines down, which is what he's done here, and that gives him the point at which to put the hands in the composition, and obviously the shoulders of Saint Elijah are following those arcs, right? And then in the square he could draw his X, and by drawing the X he gets this point, which also helps him determine the limits here and so on. So he's creatively using these geometrical constructions to create the figure of Elijah, which gives it that hieratic balance, symmetry, disposition in space that lends it a certain perfection. And that's what we're looking for. So let's take this principle of the rabattement, the infolding of one side of the rectangle, and see what happens. Here's now early Renaissance from Italy, and Giotto understood Byzantine art even though he was moving beyond the Byzantine tradition, and yet he's still using certain Byzantine principles. The infolding of one end of this rectangle, and this is a fresco on a wall now, has given him the basic structure for the Sultan's throne, and we see St. Francis appearing before the Sultan. So this creation of the space within the painting is basically made through the rabattement. Still in the Italian Renaissance, now we are at Mantegna, and Christ on the Mount of Olives. Here's Christ praying while his 3 disciples have fallen asleep. He's on the Mount of Olives, and an angel has come down from above. And you have this beautiful landscape while the Romans come to take Christ any moment now. Obviously, there are strong diagonals in this composition. A strong diagonal here, a strong diagonal there. There's a strong vertical here, right? Are these things randomly placed, or is there some underlying order and structure to all of this? This is one that I kind of discovered on my own, just as I looked at it and thought about it. Sure enough, I tried the rabattement. You fold it down, and it ends up creating a square right in here. So great, I have my square. And with that square, I can then put a diagonal, and sure enough, that diagonal seems to give us the direction for this apostle sleeping and so on, as well as Christ this way. Now, we're going to do another construction. I'm going to, now that I have my square, I'm going to do the other diagonal, which I didn't draw, and bring it down, and that will give me what is called a root 2 rectangle. I've taken this diagonal, brought it down here, and that gives me the root 2 rectangle. That explains this extension of space. And once I have this extension of space, I can draw the other diagonal, and sure enough, that other diagonal seems to be very significant within this painting, both in terms of the landscape and in terms of the pyramid that you get here for the apostles. So let's talk about root rectangles. They have been known throughout history. Lately, which is to say around the 1920s, J. Hambidge wrote a series of books called Dynamic Symmetry, based on Greek vases, where he shows that this principle has been used in Greek times in the construction of their vases. You have a square. You draw a diagonal in the square. And then with that diagonal, you bring it down. We saw that. That gives you what's called a root 2 rectangle. And if you were to actually draw 4 squares and continue that, you would get a circle around the 4 squares. You would get the circled square. Let's take the root 2 rectangle, which you have over here. Let's draw a new diagonal across the root 2 rectangle and bring it down. That gives us the root 3 rectangle. Let's repeat that step now with the root 3 rectangle. Draw a diagonal, bring it down, and that gives us the root 4, and so on into the root 5. It can go on infinitely, but they get smaller and smaller and smaller, so that really the root 5 rectangle seems to be pretty much the limit. Interestingly enough, the root 4 rectangle is a 1 to 2 rectangle, the double square. So we have created the double square through this technique of the rabattement, or dropping the side down. Also, the root 5 rectangle is actually 2 golden rectangles, in which one golden rectangle goes this way, the other golden rectangle goes that way. An interesting construction if you want to make a triptych or something like that. Now, why are root rectangles interesting? They're interesting because they will continuously be inlaid within themselves. Here's my root 2 rectangle. Within a root 2 rectangle, I can cut it in half. And when I cut it in half, I end up with 2 root rectangles. And so once I have the 2 root rectangles, I can do it again. Now I'm going to take my 1/2, cut it in half again, right? And then take that half, cut it in half again, take that half, cut it in half, and I'll end up with this spiral going around. And we see this with the golden rectangle as well, so that we have a dynamic point where all the root rectangles end up. So here's your dynamic point, kind of in the root 2 rectangle, and you have another dynamic point over here. Same thing with the root 3 rectangle then. You divide it in 3, and sure enough, you get 3 root 3 rectangles. Those can be divided infinitely as well, so you get this recursive spiral here, here, or here. And so on with the root 4 and the root 5. That's what makes them kind of interesting. Let's find an example. Salvador Dali, who was a big fan of geometry and armatures, and in this painting, The Slave Market with Disappearing Bust of Voltaire. I'm sure you've seen this, where the 2 women in the back here suddenly become the bust of Voltaire if you squint a little bit and change your perception. So, how did he create the space of this painting? He has taken a square, which again could be created through the rabattement, and then once he has his square, he draws the diagonal, brings it down, and once he does that, he gets his root 2 rectangle, which is the overall shape of this composition. He even draws an arc here to give us kind of an indication of where the square ends. And then he repeats that process by dividing it in 2. Dividing it in 2, he then does another rabattement, and then with the diagonal here, draws that diagonal across, and that gives him this, which ends up being the table that the woman is sitting at. So this is from Michael S. Schneider, Constructing the Universe, Volume 4, which he has written a whole series of books on the geometry underlying works of art. Highly recommended if you get the chance. We have them here at the Academy. Another example of a root rectangle, now it's the root 3 rectangle. This example is also from Michael Schneider. So, by taking this basic shape and dividing it in 2 so that we get the x from corner to corner, where that then crosses here gives us this division into 3. And these 1, 2, and 3 are in fact like this whole thing is a root 3 rectangle, and inscribed in the root 3 rectangle is 1, 2, 3 root 3 rectangles. And then he uses these points, right, as foundation points for drawing his diagonals, which allow these dynamic figures, Egyptian figures, to appear within his space. It's always a question whether these things were planned or whether it's coincidental. We'll never know, but it seems very clear to me that there is a strong triangle happening, and that this triangle then, and then the inverted triangle that you see over here, comes through in a certain way that seems non-coincidental. Okay, gradually we're moving more and more towards dynamic compositions, and now I would like to focus on dynamic compositions which tend to occur after the Renaissance, moving into the Mannerist and Baroque periods. That they, as art became progressively more humanist, even though we have a Greek myth here, really it's more about the nudity of the figure than it is about any story of Greek mythology. And he wanted to create a dynamic nude figure in his composition, and he wanted to do it in a way that was not totally random. So this is Tintoretto. The painting is Venus, Mars, and Vulcan. Venus, as you may know, was married to Vulcan, Hephaestus, the god of the forge, who was rather lame and ugly. But she carried on an affair with Mars. And you look around, where's Mars? And sure enough, he's hiding under the other bed over here, while Hephaestus, or Vulcan, tries to figure out what was going on. And there is young Cupid in the background. Interesting space, strongly diagonal. You get Venus on one diagonal. The space itself seems to recede on these strong diagonals. There's a mirror, a round mirror back here reflecting the whole scene. So what are the invisible lines? Let's use the most simple technique we've learned so far, the rabattement, and simply take this side of the rectangle, bring it down, and then draw a diagonal from that point. And let's repeat that in various directions. So now I'm going to take this, I'm going to bring it up here, and that gives me this point. So I'll draw another diagonal. And likewise here and here. This is from Charles Boulot, this construction, and I've spent quite a while looking at Baroque art and realized that this construction, which gives you the diamond in the center, is used repeatedly in Baroque art. And it's dynamic, right? You get the angles, the diagonals happening. The bed, as we saw, follows, and this bed here follows this diagonal, and so on. So that the action tends to happen within the box in the center over here. A beautiful construction worth remembering to create more dynamic compositions. And moving on now to another Baroque masterpiece, this one being in the Kunsthistorisches Museum here in Vienna from Rubens, called the Il Defenso Altar, a triptych. So we've learned certain principles. We let our eye wander over the painting. We ask ourselves, where are the invisible lines? What's important for the artist? The diagonals, the orthogonals, which diagonals? Is there perfect symmetry or not symmetry in this painting? And so on. When my eye wanders, I notice that there's definitely a strong angle over here, another strong angle over there, and that these most likely continue. I can sense that there's kind of like a box happening in here, and so I wonder if he has not used the rabattement to get that box. So when we start to actually put in the lines, we discover that sure enough, it follows the construction that we were seeing before, and that this diagonal over here goes all the way across to that corner here. This diagonal over here goes all the way across to the corner over there. And then through that construction, as well as the other ones from this corner as well to here, and from this corner to here, we get that box in the middle. And that box is where the interesting things are happening. She is not perfectly symmetrical, the Virgin in the center, but definitely there is this symmetry happening because it's a triptych of movement towards the center, and then in the center we kind of circle around. I would like to also note that then, for example, this line here, that when you see the base of a pillar, for example, probably the artist is marking a certain point, which is important in the construction. This point is also important because it's the ground on which the Virgin is standing. So they're using certain points at which to create new constructions. And when you then take this and take this, this gives you another construction point. Let's focus on these cherubs at the top and ask ourselves, are they just kind of randomly placed? Or are they actually playing with the lines of armature that are there. And to me, it seems fairly clear that he has created this cherub at a diagonal over here, created the other one pretty much at a vertical, and the other one at a horizontal, because he wants to really have them straddling certain lines of the armature. And you'll see that happen quite often in Baroque works of art, where ornamental devices, like these cherubs, for example, play with the lines of armature in the painting. So I'd like to finish this talk then with the thought of how to move the eye through the composition. Probably the greatest example of that would be Raphael's School of Athens. Obviously, your eye is attracted immediately to the center of the composition. But then as it starts to wander, it starts to pick up on various groupings and becomes aware that there is this triangular grouping down here. There's another grouping here, more of a dynamic triangle here. Let's focus in on that grouping over there. And when we looked at the figure last class, we looked at the pose. We spoke of the idea that basically you have the plumb line, and then part of the figure is tensed, and the will is moving up that part of the figure, while the other part is more relaxed, and that's the force of gravity and repose. And so gravity and repose move down while the will moves up. And as the will moves up, and especially in the contrapposto, it crosses, finally it gets released. And it gets released either in a gesture, which in this case is him holding that harmonic device, the lyre, which we saw, the tetrachord, the symbol of harmony. This is the god Apollo. So here's the god Apollo holding with his willful gesture the instrument of harmony, and the glance. He turns his head, and then all the energy of the figure is released in a glance. So when we look at a grouping of figures, and the way Raphael turns our gaze, first we feel the strong gesture of Euclid with his compass making a mark on this other tablet, which is one of the great mysteries of art. What he's actually designing on the tablet, the geometrical shape, is up to various interpretations. Then the other figures kind of draw our eye to that action. They reinforce, through their whole movement of their body, they reinforce that movement of the eye towards that gesture, amplifying it. Except for him. Right? And he, in the center of that, suddenly catches our eye. He's turning away, he's gazing that way, and so our eye goes out of that circular grouping towards these figures over here. And we end up looking at those figures who themselves are turning this way to, guess who? Raphael himself. So our eye is directed continuously in a certain direction through the composition. Let's finish today by looking at this painting by Poussin, The Inspiration of the Poet. And Poussin, as we learned earlier in this class, was the French artist who lived in Rome and transmitted a lot of the principles from the Renaissance to academic painting in France, which then spread through the other academies. And same question, what invisible lines, what armature has he used to compose this very harmonious, very classical painting? It's called The Inspiration of the Poet. There's the poet over here. He's got the stylus or pen in his hand. This we now recognize. The man with the lyre is Apollo, the god of harmony, and he is pointing towards the writing of the poet, who himself is gazing upward, being crowned with the laurels. And this female figure, the muse, looking, and this smaller figure, like a Cupid, also gazing with the crown of laurels. Where does our eye go first? Contrast is one of the best ways to attract the eye. Wherever there's a strong contrast, the eye will go there first. And in the case of Poussin, we know from many of his paintings that he actually wants you to read from left to right. He tends to put some object in the left that really attracts your eye. And then what's she doing? Well, she's gazing that way. And then we start to hit other important points in the contrast, like the knee, like the shoulder, and so on. So using the principle of contrast, light and dark, is one way to attract the eye. Now, in terms of the harmonious construction of space, we talked about the halves and the diapason. Here, his lyre, which is the instrument of harmony, is itself right at the most harmonious point in the entire painting, at the center, boom. And it seems to be as if projecting its harmony outward in all directions in the composition. Let's try and impose our harmonic armature on this composition and see if it tells us anything. And sure enough, it's not just the halves that are important, but also the quarters, which here and here, right? If we draw a vertical along the quarters, we get the muse. If we draw another vertical along the thirds, we get the Cupid-like figure. And the main action, which is to say where Apollo is pointing to the book of the poet, is also happening at a third. I don't think it's terribly coincidental. I think he's planning this out. And we know that Poussin actually created little models and made a theater set in his studio, which he used lighting, and he posed and sculpted his little models to make them into a perfectly lit scene that he could then paint. So he was very consciously aware of what he was doing. Coincidentally, the lines, the diagonal lines, seem to have a certain meaning as well. But we learned from Raphael, and I think Poussin learned from Raphael as well, that the energy in the figure directs our gaze, right? Our little Cupid, he's not just standing perfectly straight, he's got a little contrapposto movement to him. One leg is bearing all the weight, the other one has the heel up and so is in repose. And then as he does this slight contrapposto twist, the energy of his gaze then moves out of the body. Same thing with her, right? She's directing our gaze, and the gaze is constantly directed from left to right in the direction of that key point. And then you ask yourself, where does it go from there? He's moved our gaze towards this key point, and then from there we would naturally want to do this. And the final Cupid, as well as the poet, are gazing upward. That is called the vertical glance, something that Raphael and Perugino used repeatedly in their paintings. The vertical glance to a higher dimension, to a higher space and plane, outside of the picture plane. It's the transcendental gaze. And even though, here we're looking to something very human, the poet himself is divinely inspired, and being divinely inspired takes our gaze out of the painting and into this invisible, higher, transcendental idea, beyond images, beyond words. So that's where I would like to stop with this presentation of composition, reminding you then that all of those lines, and we saw many of them, are there for you to play with. They're there for you to explore, and they're not there for you to feel imprisoned like Rilke's panther. Rather, like Blake's tiger, I want you to feel burning, burning in the night, this creative spark that allows your imagination to flow around all these lines that will harmonize your composition. Thank you so much for listening.